Good morning, lovelies. Today we are asking the question, what is the difference between science fiction and Afrofuturism? And some of you may be asking, what the hell is Afrofuturism? Don't worry, I gotcha. Before we get started, remember to subscribe to the channel for more videos on science fiction, fantasy, and horror through a feminist lens. If you want to directly support this channel and get some bonus content, check out my Patreon page. That link is in the description. So science fiction, we all kind of already know this one. I talked about it in my first What's the Difference video where I compared it to fantasy. Basically, sci-fi is a literary genre where the world is futuristic or has huge technological advances or environmental changes. Stories with time travel, space exploration, aliens, anything set in the future, etc. The science doesn't have to be exact, it just has to be plausible enough to maybe happen at some point. So, no magic, because magic in any form just does not exist. That would be science fantasy. Science fiction has a very long history as a genre, started by Mary Shelley in the 19th century with her novel Frankenstein, and then built upon by Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and Ursula K. Le Guin, among many, many others. So if I don't mention your all-time favorite classical sci-fi author, I'm sorry, there's just so many, and it has 100 of subgenres. Dystopia, steampunk, cyberpunk, dieselpunk. I should just do a video all on punks. It's insane. And like many genres, it is also more of a setting than a story type, because it can be anything from tragic to satirical to kids media. Now on the surface, Afrofuturism looks like another subgenre of science fiction. It just happens to center around Black people and culture, specifically African and African descended. But it's a lot more complicated and fascinating than that. Dr. Nnedi Okorafor, one of the greatest Afrofuturist writers today, and I highly, highly, highly recommend her work, uses the octopus analogy in a TED Talk she gave. Humans and octopuses, octopi? Are actually very similar in terms of intelligence and degrees of personality. But despite our similarities, we evolved from two very different evolutionary trees. It's the same thing with science fiction and Afrofuturism. They're similar and even have some overlap, but they evolved from totally different sources and are thus quite different. Afrofuturism is not a subgenre. It evolved on its own. It's not even a story genre. Stories are a big part of Afrofuturism, but it's its own thing. It's a cultural aesthetic, a philosophy of science, and a philosophy of history that explores the relationship between various Black cultures and technology. Although the term was originally created in 1993, Afrofuturism started way earlier, with books like Light Ahead for the Negro published in 1904, and probably before even that. The genre got noticed by the mainstream in the mid-1970s, with Sun Ra's music that centered around Blackness and outer space, and then it spread into other fields like art, philosophy, and of course, stories. In terms of storytelling, Afrofuturism has its own set of subgenres. African futurism is specific to the relationship between Africa and technology, often taking place in a future version of the continent, and is argued by its writers to be completely divorced from the white Western gaze, unlike their definition of Afrofuturism, which centers on the Black diaspora and, as such, usually takes place in countries outside of Africa. Africanfuturism is storytelling that incorporates African spirituality, cosmology, and religion into the story, often blending it seamlessly with technology and sci-fi elements. You're gonna get magic here. If you want a really, really good example of this, read anything by Nnedi Okorafor. Yes, I know that is the second time I've mentioned her in this video, but she's really fucking good and a goddess in this genre, and you should really read her work. A lot of superhero stories are Afrofuturist, even though they take place in the modern day, and we're gonna get back to that in a minute. A lot of them imagine a world totally free of white supremacy and other structures that have and continue to oppress Black people today. Others, especially those that are not specifically African futurist, deal explicitly with what it's like living under such structures and possible ways of how to break free of them. A story does not have to be, strictly speaking, science fiction to be Afrofuturist. It can be fantasy with a magic system based on African or African American folklore, or superhero, or alt history, or whatever. The author Nova Sparks has a really great quote on the subject. In Afrofuturism, Black people imagine ourselves and create whole worlds where we not only achieve greatness, but we are thriving in our own culture. There is a reason why films like Black Panther and novels written by Octavia Butler resonate so much in the African diaspora. We see the possibilities of a society of Black men and women that is steeped in our history, but also embraces our advancement while protecting both as a means for survival. Seeing this can and has inspired more of us to invest in our communities, to continue to dominate in the STEM field and the arts, and to move forward in our quest to reach back into our communities by creating opportunities and guidance for our youth. Now, she mentioned Black Panther there, so we're gonna go back to that, because despite not being science fiction, it is definitely Afrofuturist, and we've all seen it, we're all familiar with it. Wakanda is a society that has never been touched by Europe or European descendants, and as a result, it has its culture and history completely intact. It has a great relationship with its own unique technology, and on top of that, it is later able to make a major impact on the world in later MCU movies like Infinity War and Endgame. T'Challa gives the Avengers an entire army to fight Thanos. Twice! And this is probably why a lot of white people don't really like the genre, or at least they don't feel connected to it, because it's not for us. I posted the question, what is the difference between science fiction and Afrofuturism, to a bunch of my Facebook groups to get a feel for what people already knew about it and also their thoughts on it. At least half of the commenters said that they had never even heard of the term before, and several mentioned that the idea of creating an entire genre just for one race or ethnicity, no matter how historically excluded and oppressed they are, is racist. But science fiction has always been racist. We don't really like to think about it, especially since, despite that, the sci-fi genre as a whole has been pretty progressive in terms of questioning the technologies, government, and social structures of the time. But like most American storytelling, or American anything really, sci-fi is still very, very white and very, very male. As progressive as the genre is, it's just not enough. And no, you do not get to point to one movie or one television show that has a Black person as a main character or a not an all-white cast and say, there, see, this one program or this handful of programs are progressive. This is not racist. This genre is not racist. It's not enough. Oh, and for those of you who, like me, are starved for women in speculative fiction, Afrofuturism is very feminist. There are a ton of awesome women in the center of these stories, which is probably why I love this genre so much. I don't care that I'm not the intended audience. I will pick up an Afrofuturist book and just devour it. So tell me your favorite in the comments below so that I can check it out and add it to my Amazon wishlist. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and if you can, support us on Patreon. That link is in the description. Bye, lovelies!
There were pickpockets and dope peddlers, murderers and thieves, card shop gamblers with aces up their sleeves, bank robbers, burglars, boots and